Transform our lives for the sake of your kingdom. I speak to you now in the name of God, who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. Some words from Luke's Gospel, which you have just heard read, Luke chapter 18 and verse 14. There Jesus said, I tell you, this man, this tax collector, went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will indeed be exalted. Growing up in Sunday school, and then later as I was preparing for confirmation, I recall my teachers at that time bringing to my attention this notion of the 7 deadly sins. I don't know how many of you were taught that, or all sins are deadly, right? But the 7 deadly sins, that's how it was framed for us. And they used the acronym PALE gas, P-A-L-E-G-A-S, PALE gas. So the P came from the initial letter of the word pride. The A came from anger. The L came from lust. Does this sound familiar to anyone? No? All right, well, I'm teaching you about pale gas. The E came from envy. The G, can anyone guess?
Agreed.
Gluttony, yes. So, right, a form of greed. The A, again, came from avarice. That is, that extreme greed for wealth or for material gain. The S came from sloth. I heard it. Slothfulness. Right? And these were or are considered to be directly related, or at least at the root of all of the other immoralities in the Christian life. Pride, anger, lust, envy, gluttony, avarice, and sloth. It has even been thought that the first in this list, the sin of pride, is the primary one at the root of them all. So if you have pride, all these other things come along with it, right? So pride, in this sense, is understood to mean that quality of having an excessively high opinion of oneself. I mean, it's good to have a good opinion, but having an excessively high opinion of oneself or of one's importance. And so, in pride, right, when you have that kind of pride, all people, and all other circumstances effectively become secondary to ourselves or to our own circumstances. And so this, of course, when everyone else is secondary to, right, to the me, to the I, at the center of our lives, it then gives us a kind of permission to relate to them angrily, right, or lustfully, or enviously, or gluttonously, or avariciously, or slothfully, simply because we have by our actions, because of how we think of the other, we have effectively refused to love the neighbor as we do our own selves. We place ourselves at the center, and everyone else is secondary. And so closely associated with the sin of pride is therefore a measure of presumptuousness. And we've all met presumptuous people. Have we? So to make sure I'm not losing it. We've all met presumptuous people. And presumptuousness is simply that failure to observe the limits of what is either permitted or appropriate in a particular circumstance. Right? So when you are presumptuous, you just don't know, for whatever reason, where the limits are. And so in a general sense, the failure to observe those limits which are permitted, those limits which are appropriate in any given circumstance, it can happen. You can fail to observe those things for any number of reasons. But I believe that it happens mainly out of ignorance, in the truest sense of the word. Right? That person simply lacks sufficient knowledge. They simply lack enough information in order to be able to act any differently. And so you can be presumptuous just out of ignorance. And so, in effect, the presumptuous person that is on their own, they will rarely recognize that they are presumptuous. In fact, being presumptuous is something that will have to be pointed out to them. But in a spiritual sense, right, since we're not just physical creatures, but we are also spiritual creatures, in a spiritual sense, the failure to observe permitted or appropriate limits is the result of sin. It's not just ignorance, but it is also the result of sin, and in particular, the sin, pride. And so prideful people also tend very often to be presumptuous people, and failing to observe, therefore, the limits of what is permitted, the limits of what is appropriate. So in this familiar account of the Pharisee and the tax collector who went up to the temple to pray, Luke begins this parable by telling us why Jesus told him. He said that Jesus told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. In other words, this parable was told to those who perhaps had an excessively high opinion of their own righteousness, who had an excessively high opinion of their own importance. And so in accordance with this parable, the Pharisee was essentially talking to himself, or praying within himself, as the language suggests. He stood there, off to himself, enumerating all of his spiritual virtues, all the things that he had achieved in the presence of God. And if we read that passage carefully, we will note that on at least 4 occasions, he uses this word I. Right? God, I thank you that I am not like other people. Thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. We can almost imagine him pointing, right? I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all my income. That may even count as an I, right? My income. And so as we listen to his prayer, it is clear that his focus, even in praying, was more about himself, on his spiritual virtues, on his accomplishments, than on the God in whose presence he even stood to pray. So his excessively high opinion of his own righteousness and importance, it made this a very prideful prayer. But his presumptuousness, and this is where the other part comes in, his presumptuousness is seen in his failure to observe the limits of such thinking, the limits of having that kind of posture, that is, when one comes to stand and pray in the presence of this one who is God of all creation. Right? We can do that stuff when we were on our own, but when we're praying to God, we need to take stock. Scripture reminds us that the Lord does not see as mortals see. The Lord looks on the heart. And so in the presence of this God, such prideful praying is neither permitted nor is it appropriate. So when we recognize who this God is, then we begin to see the limits of some of the things that we can and cannot do, even in prayer. That kind of prayer was simply out of place. Now the tax collector, on the other hand, in honest humility, he recognized the great grace with which he could indeed come and stand and find his place before the justice and mercy of God. We are told he would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast, perhaps in great anguish, and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. He knew exactly where he stood in the presence of the Almighty God. And friends, as fallen creatures, still beloved by the living God, as we all are, as those who endeavor to be disciples of this Jesus Christ, whom we worship as Lord, the reality is that we inhabit both positions. We inhabit the position of the Pharisee, but also the position of the tax collector. So there's a commentary on this passage which explains how we can end up doing this, how we can end up inhabiting both positions from a point of pride. He writes, there is the Pharisee who rehearses his virtues, who downgrades others, not measuring up to his standard of piety. He had a good standard of piety, but that wasn't the point. This Pharisee warns us about our presumptuousness in the presence of God. Indeed, even when we listen to that, we are all familiar with that assessment of the Pharisee. We know that there was something wrong with this, but the commentator suggests further that in our interactions with one another, and this is where the rubber hits the road, as we gather to pray, Sunday by Sunday, week by week, if we are not careful, we will find ourselves acting like the tax collector turned Pharisee. What does he mean by this? He says, we might pray, God, I thank you that I am not like this Pharisee, self-righteous, arrogant, who thinks that his good works set him apart from the rest of us ordinary folks and make him special. Lord, you and I know that these prayers that he is offering will never be accepted. And so we may look at our pious neighbor and pray that kind of prayer. Friends, if we are not careful, we could just as easily find ourselves standing in the position of the tax collector described for us in today's parable, but yet acting toward our neighbor, acting towards those around us with the prideful presumption of the Pharisee. Everyone follow what I'm saying so far? So we could be in both positions from a point of pride. And friends, and it's important that we let this sink in, right? We are not the standard by which those around us will be judged. We are not the standard by which those around us should be judged or measured. And until we recognize that, until we allow that to sink deep within us, we will always act presumptuously toward our fellow human beings. That is, we will always fail to recognize the limits of our own human capacities. We will always fail to recognize what is permitted, what is appropriate, in terms of the way that we think, in terms of the way that we speak, in terms of the way that we act towards those around us. Because we will be measuring them by our standards, forgetting that we all stand in the need of grace of God. And so the tax collector in today's parable, he models for us the kind of honesty. He models for us a kind of sober humility, which is fitting, that which is appropriate for us as disciples of Jesus Christ, as those who stand by grace and by grace alone in the presence of the living God. And so in fulfillment of the prophecy which we heard from the book of the prophet Joel this morning, Joel reminds us that God has indeed poured out his Spirit upon all flesh, upon all creation. God has unleashed a power at work among us, even to this present day, a power which is truly phenomenal, friends. It is a power which does not come with the force of an army, but which comes through the obedience, the whisper of that still small voice. But it is a power which enables, and it is also a power which encourages us to live truly prophetic lives in the midst of a world, in the midst of an age which is passing away. And you know, God desires for you and for me and for all creation to receive that power, and to receive that power daily, to become more and more a part of that transformation which is being brought about in this creation. You remember Jesus says, "When I am lifted up, I will draw the whole world to myself." And so we may look around and think that what we see with our eyes is the real world. But friends, the real world is that which God has brought and is bringing into being, even as he draws us all to himself. And the scriptures remind us that the God who has begun this good work in us, in each and every one of us, is the same God who will one day bring it all to completion in him. And so Joel says, then everyone, right, when the Spirit is poured out, when everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. And so friends, wherever you may be, we can all, sometimes it's easy for us to look around like the Pharisee did and to look at the spiritual lives of others and compare it to ourselves, but this is about where we are. And so wherever you may be in your spiritual life, I invite you to call on the name of this God. To recognize the great grace in which we stand to be able even to do so. To take the opportunity to set aside whatever prideful notions we may have of ourselves. Because God sees through all of that stuff. Set aside whatever prideful notions we have of ourselves. Set aside the presumptions. Set aside the arrogance. Set aside our own egotism, where we are at the center of our lives. And simply call on him. Simply say to him, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I recognize who I am and where I am in your presence. For friends, in him and in him alone, may we find certainty to receive God's divine justice, to receive God's divine mercy, to receive God's divine favor, to receive God's divine grace. Jesus says, for all who exalt themselves will be humbled. So we either do it now voluntarily, or we do it in the end. But he says, for all who humble themselves, they will indeed